All right, once again, good morning. Thank you for choosing us here on the BTV News channel and on Botswana Connects this morning. We continue with our theme of looking at the OAU 60th celebrations. We focus today on the role of civil society, which is bringing it down to the level of the citizen in the whole evolution of the continent in the last 60 years, with particular focus on the role that they have played through partnerships, dialogues, policies, and activities that are geared towards defending the culture of good governance and thereby improving lives of the citizens. Lebogang Kenneth Mabotho, who is the chairperson of the Credentials Committee of the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, joins me here in studio to look at these issues. Let me thank you for coming through, Mr. Mabotho, and welcome to Botswana Connects.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. When we're talking, I'll use the acronym Ecosocc,
okay.
in short.
Yes.
When we're talking Ecosocc and, of course, the mandate being a civil society, and this 2023, we're saying it's been 60 years that this organization has been in place. Are we celebrating? Are you seeing, would you say cause for celebration is there?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because we're actually celebrating the 60 years of the AU, or the OAU as it was formerly known.
Right.
The existence of that's what we are celebrating. And there is detailed history of the achievements, albeit with challenges along the way, that this great organ has actually achieved.
Right.
And I feel that every African needs to familiarize himself or herself with the work of the OAU, the work of the AU as it's now known, as well as the Ecosocc that you've mentioned, which is an organ on the structure of the AU.
Just to set the stage, if you were to mention, maybe in list form, what would you say have been the successes?
Firstly, at its inception, the OAU looked at making sure that each African state enjoys its independence, its territorial integrity, and its sovereignty on the global stage.
Right.
So that was achieved because the OAU started in 1963. It was a vision by leaders, former founding fathers of Africa, such as Kwame Nkrumah. And
the Kamuzu Bandas.
The Kamuzu Bandas,
right.
The Toures, and of I think it's, was it Benin or Guinea rather, yes. And, what they wanted to see was an Africa that no longer bears traces of the colonial past of the continent. So it was to get rid of the vestiges of colonialism. And by 1977, we see 50 African states having independence. And out of 50, which is now 55, back then it was around 54. Out of that number, that's a pretty good percentage to warrant celebration, I believe.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's by way of, I was asking to, if we could look at and communicate to those that might not be in realization or an appreciation of the successes that this organ has achieved, is that liberalization objective.
Yes.
But then since 2002, when focus changed, what can we count then in terms of attainments or achievements or successes that the organ continued to attain?
Okay. Now, when the transition happened from the OAU to the AU in 2002, that came on the back of a vision for a united and collectively prosperous and independent Africa.
Yes.
But more now moving to the development side of things within the continent, where Africa is meant to be leading its own cause in terms of development on the continent, as opposed to having global entities, foreign global entities that come in to dictate the pace, to dictate the mandate of different African states in how development in their countries ought to take place based on the financial power or the financial muscle. So the things that I can list briefly are that right now we can talk about something we call the African Continental Free Trade Agreement,
yes.
which so far 47 out of the 55 member states have ratified and signed.
Right.
It has its challenges. I believe we can get into those as we go along with the conversation.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things. And then we have military cooperation among the states that has seen our conflict-ridden continent, for the most part, being managed despite the challenges that poses.
Yeah.
Ideally, we would not want to have conflict on our continent by now, but we are still moving in that direction, and there are so many areas that we can talk about when we look at places where the African Union has provided military support to quell conflict, to mediate, to make sure that the African citizens are protected as much as possible.
Okay.
Even on the health front, we can see during the recent pandemic, the COVID pandemic,
yeah.
There was the joint African Union vaccination acquisition task force, and that helped to get close to 1 billion vaccines onto the continent. Yes.
Okay. And all that you've just described as achievement post refocusing attention by the then OAU transitioning into the AU is summed up in a one line, a sentence, which is the objective of the AU, which I would have to ask you to recite because I could not get it correct.
That's the vision of the AU.
Yes.
And it's what's leading what we call the Agenda 2063. I think we can also get into that as we move on. But briefly, it speaks of the vision or the dream to see an integrated Africa, an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global stage.
Okay.
Yes.
That is it sums all of the works and the functions. Yes. An integrated and prosperous, peaceful Africa, and
driven by its own citizens.
Driven by its own citizens. And of
that's
course,
now the focus of the AU.
Driven by its own citizens. Yes. Let's come to the citizens, because then that speaks to civil society. That speaks to the work that I'd like for us to focus on today. 60 years later, what would you say has been the role or even the participation, the involvement of organizations that are doing civil work in the functions and advancements of objectives of the AU?
The role of civil society remains integral. It's always been important to any vision that's laid out, any plans that are made concerning the continent, because civil society typically plays the role of amplifying the voice of the citizen from grassroots levels, speaking to those that are in decision-making positions, the leaders that we have in our different member states. So as policies are being made, there has to be contribution from the people that these policies are aimed at.
Absolutely.
Yeah, people have to determine what they want to see in place and what they wish to abide by in order to see the future that they desire.
Right.
So one of the flaws, I would say, of the OAU, though well-intended, was that a lot of the policy making, a lot of the programs, a lot of the instruments that were coming were adopting a top-down approach. And now with the AU transition, the voice of the citizen became the basis, the foundation, the premise of departure, if you will, such that nothing can be done without the say-so of the citizen on the ground. That's the ideal that the AU stands for.
What does that even look like? Because I think without awareness, a lot of citizens of Africa might still be feeling that this is happening at a governance level, at a policy level, and not realizing that it is, of course, it has to be informed by the interests of us, the citizens. So is there a coordination, or what is in place that is formal and structural about the engagement of the civil society in the African Union? In
the African Union, we have an organ called the Economic, Social and Cultural Council of the African Union, the AU Ecosocc. And that's the one that I also am a part of, and I'm here in that capacity as the chairperson of the Credentials Committee of the Ecosocc. So the Ecosocc was formed in 2004, July 2004.
This is 2 years after transition to AU. 2 years
after the transition, because 2002 is when we moved now from the OAU to the launching of the AU.
Right.
Yes. And so when the AU decided now to be the AU and started functioning as the AU, there was need to really bring civil society closer to the decision-making processes and to have them contribute to policy making, have them have much of the say in how they want the continent governed. And to do that, this organ was put in place. And what it does is it connects with the African civil society through what we call the General Assembly of the Ecosocc. So far, we are on the 4th General Assembly, and it was instituted in December of 2022 rather, sorry. So it has, and each General Assembly has a 4-year mandate. And currently we are in our first year of the 4th General Assembly. And it was instituted in Nairobi, Kenya. And it invites civil society organizations from across the continent and even in the diaspora for Africans who are living abroad, so that they also can still have a say, can still have access to policy-making decisions through this organ. Yes.
Describe for us the nature of this engagement, because then one wonders then how strong is that structure, or how intentional is that structure, and that would speak to issues of effectiveness of the mandate that you are doing, which is connecting the AU, as you're saying, with the civil society. How does it work?
It's very strong in that, as you've said, not only does it deal with the citizens on the ground, it also connects them to the higher structures of the AU.
Right.
And on the structure of the AU itself, you have what we call the General Assembly at the top. That consists of, or is comprised of, the heads of state from the different member states of the African Union, which are all the countries at the moment, 55 member states. And after that, we have what we call the Executive Council. That is made up of the foreign ministers from the different member states. And then you have a specialized or the Permanent Representatives Committee, rather. Those are technocrats, those are policy gurus who help those in the assembly,
General Assembly,
and the executive to function well. And then you have the the specialized technical committees now. They also work hand in hand with the PRCs that I mentioned, the permanent representatives. And then you have the Peace and Security Council. And after that, you come to now the Pan-African Parliament and the Ecosocc. These two now, the Pan-African Parliament and the Ecosocc, are the main ones that work with civil society. But all these other organs, because you have things like the African Commission on Humans and People's Rights, you have the AU Advisory Board on Corruption, and you have the AU Commission on International Law. You know, there are legal aspects, there are health aspects to it, culture, this. So all of these organs that take care of these things always involve civil society organizations. Now, what the Ecosocc is doing at the moment, and how it's been doing its work, is to engage with civil society by strengthening the methods of advocacy, strengthening the methods of representation for the people, and making sure that they are engaged whenever there is a policy issue being discussed, to get their voice, to have them lead actually in those discussions, to say, no, we don't want this thing that you're proposing, we want it done this way or that way, and then having their voice heard. And this is then taken, or is then coupled with research and put into reports and position papers that are then taken all the way up the structures to the heads of state.
Let's take Botswana. the work that Ecosocc has done or is doing in Botswana. So what do? You get a list of civil society organizations, like from where, and then how do you actually get in conversation?
There's always, I think that actually is an aspect that the Ecosocc is even working harder to improve. But at the moment, what's been happening is there's a call that's sent out, a call for interest.
Yes.
Yeah. So that people can express their interest, but by following the set guidelines and the requirements. And among those requirements are that the society or the organization should be recognized in its home country. In other words, officially registered with the right structures, with the right oversight bodies. In our case, it's the Registrar of Societies.
Right.
Yes, so the organization has to have registration there. It's an added advantage for it to also be recognized by an oversight body such as the Botswana Council of Non-Governmental Organizations. Yes, and the organization should not be politically affiliated.
Okay.
The organization should not have more than 50% foreign funding.
I see.
Yes, because that's another challenge, the issue of funding.
It determines decision-making in some extent.
Exactly.
Yes.
So then the organization needs to also prove that it's been active for at least 3 years.
I see.
And that comprises of activities coupled with audited financial reports for those 3 years to ensure also that it uses funds accordingly. There are no issues of mismanagement of funds and things like that. And then that's taken in through the credentials committee now. That's where we sit, we go through all of those, and we look at which organizations qualify for the next stage, which is now the voting in, or the voting in of these organizations into the General Assembly when it convenes. So the invitation is for 2 national CSOs or NGOs. National meaning they only operate at national level within the country.
Territory,
yeah. And then there are those that are regional, those that in our case would be operating in the SADC region, and then those that are continental.
Okay.
Yes. So it's 2 that are at national level, and then there's room for a regional one, there's room for a continental one.
Okay.
So you can have up to 4 from one country.
Interesting.
Yes.
And you know, what criteria goes into the call, the call is what you called it, the invitation of interest. This is just to check and satisfy issues of legitimacy and issues of integrity of the work that such organization is doing. And then one wonders then, in your findings with the works that you have been doing, how strong are you finding, and influential are you finding organizations? I'll take Botswana first before I go to Africa. In Botswana, civil society organizations in Botswana, you did mention that when it comes to issues of health, corruption, and so on and so forth, of course they are dealt with through these organizations at the citizen level. But how influential or how legitimate and strong are you finding them as the credentials committee?
I'm trying to understand. You mean in terms of how impactful is the work of the civil society?
Yes.
Okay, yes. We wish it was more impactful.
Right.
Yes, and we aim to have it more impactful. That is the work of the Ecosocc in a nutshell. We provide instruments, tools, and frameworks for these organizations to be more effective in their advocacy. More effective coming out of the realization that most of our organizations, you mentioned Botswana, for example, Botswana is largely funded by, I think it's the, am I free to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
By the European Union.
Okay.
And you find others lean more towards the American Embassy. And you have the United States Agency for
So then that disqualifies one factor in the...
No. It depends on how much of that funding constitutes the total.
Okay, what percentage?
Yes, the total finance or funds that the organization operates on in a given year. So there's a 50-50 quota. 50 has to be locally sourced or within Africa.
Okay.
Yes. And then 50 can be international. Now, to your question of how effective.
Yes.
There are some who are quite effective and who are quite impactful in their work, in as far as advocacy work goes, in as far as policy making processes are concerned, and the contribution thereto. Sadly, it's not as many as we would wish to see, because there is a challenge of funding. A challenge in the sense that for one to access funding, they have to satisfy the requirements of the one from whom the funding is coming.
Absolutely.
And in that case, you find one of the challenges we are faced with is CSOs tend to now gravitate towards aligning themselves with what will qualify them for the funding, as opposed to sticking to their cause and sticking to the mandate that could see them being more on the side of the citizens and on the side of ensuring that they hold those in power to account.
Is there any support that you're giving in that the concern, your funding as Ecosocc?
As Ecosocc, we don't fund CSOs at the moment.
Okay.
At the moment. However, because our funding actually comes from the member states through the AU budget. And we also have international development partners. We also work with the EU. We also work with different international development partners and other sources of funding. However, we take care not to engage with such on a level that compromises our vision and our mandate.
We're coming close to the end, and because the reason why we're having the conversation around civil society is because we're bringing down the African Union to the citizen.
Yes.
Yes. And as partners that should be in development, in fostering a good governance that a civil society ought to be, I would like for you to speak to where you're realizing the key challenges and perhaps suggestions for solutions, so that their level of participation can indeed ensure the level of engagement of the African citizen. Yes.
Firstly, it's on the back of what we just spoke about, the issue of funding, but I would rather put it this way, that most civil societies in Africa are dealing with limited resources, funding being key to that. And then it leads to financial constraints. But there are other factors, such as some member states having restrictive laws that prohibit civil societies from freedom of expression, even for the citizen at grassroots levels. There is no freedom of expression because of regulations that prohibit that. And then you find that there's no permission for assembly, because civil society rides on the back of the masses. If you can't access the masses, if you can't engage the masses, if you can't mobilize the masses, then you don't really have a voice as civil society. So you find that restrictive laws in some places, political instability, the corruption that we often hear of on the continent, and the lack of good governance in some of the states.
Okay.
And the other big one is the lack of information and limited technological resources. Now, on that one of information, it also comes to awareness about the existence of structures such as the AU by African citizens. Lack of awareness about the existence of Ecosocc by even civil society organizations themselves.
Okay.
So there is a need, as we are celebrating 60 years, for our civil society organizations, firstly, to familiarize themselves with what Africa is all about in terms of the vision of the African Union, what resources and structures are in place to help the work of civil society.
Right. And then
in different member states, yes.
That to me then speaks to media.
Yes.
And what is the intention of the African Union or the action of the African Union in utilizing this very vital tool? For that particular purpose is that the African citizen to be aware of the African Union and its functions and so on and so forth. Yeah.
That's why I'm grateful that we're actually here sitting and talking on national TV about such things.
Right.
The African Union values the contributions of the media, because without that, none of what the African Union stands for can be known, let alone understood. The media itself needs to realize that it's also part of the civil society by definition.
Absolutely.
That's another thing, because often we find in civil society, when we do our workshops, when we do our engagements, that civil society organizations feel that what they're doing is not being covered. And there's this whole long process of trying to get media personnel or media houses to come and cover the events and activities. And what one notices in there is that there's lack of information on both sides, where civil society doesn't realize that media is actually supposed to be a partner, and the media also should realize that it's affected by anything that affects the civil society.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's all the time that I have with you today, and I hope that as we progress towards Thursday, then we can get more insight from you to inform our audiences.
Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Speaking there with Lebogang Mabotho from Ecosocc, which is an organ of the African Union, and of course concerned with civil society engagement and the credentials that, of course, engage that civil society. And we're talking now the African Union at the level of citizens. And of course, do you remember that on Thursday, the African Union Africa Day, we're commemorating 60 years of the works that have been done by Africa as a unit.